Hello and welcome to episode 7 of my Stuarts course vlog. In this episode we're going to try and look at the Protectorate. There's quite a lot to get through here, so we're going to try and run through what happens and we'll see how time's going, but we may sort of pick out some themes and reasons for the collapse of the Protectorate, leading towards the restoration next time. So the Protectorate starts in the aftermath of the fall of the Nominated Assembly. In the autumn of 1653, the army chiefly needs to try and find a way of running England. And so for the first time in English history, a written constitution is created. This is created mostly by John Lambert, who becomes one of the major generals, and it establishes the idea of a Lord Protector. The Lord Protector really takes the position of the monarch, and this is one of the controversies actually of the whole Protectorate, is how much Oliver Cromwell, who becomes Lord Protector, is actually a monarch in disguise. He is at this stage monarch for life, but it's not a hereditary post. He is supported by a Council of State of 13 to 21 members, and underneath that, and alongside him, a Parliament. He has to call a Parliament every 3 years. And it will consist of 400 English representatives and, for the first time ever, Scottish and Irish representatives as well, 30 of each. Actually, I guess the 400 English included some Welsh. I'm not really sure about that, actually. It must sit for at least 5 months when it met. And into the instrument of government also, there was the right, the freedom of worship, except for Catholics. So that was, again, an entrenched right within that constitution. Now, under that, Cromwell calls the first Protectorate Parliament in 1654. He'd been Lord Protector already by 9 months. He had loads of ideas. He wanted to reform finances and the law system and religion. He even had a plan for highway repairs, but none of these actually get passed because when it meets after the elections held, the first Protectorate Parliament has Presbyterian and Republican representatives, those who don't want the Lord Protector, and Royalist representatives as well, and they are all angry about the instrument of government and spend a lot of time debating whether it's legal. They're upset about the influence of the army, of course, who had drawn it up, and the protection of the army was written into the constitution as well. And they're also cross about religious toleration. And so after as absolutely soon as he can, Cromwell dissolves the first Protectorate Parliament, and very little is achieved by it. And the instrument government said he had to keep them there for 5 months, and Cromwell decides that it must be 5 lunar months rather than 5 calendar months. And so dismisses them literally as soon as he can find a reason for it. Instead, he then switches to a period of 15 months rule through major generals. This is an attempt to use the military to impose stability upon the country. This is prompted by a couple of things. Firstly, there's a royalist uprising in Wiltshire. And secondly, the failure of what's called the Western Design, which is an attempt to capture Hispaniola in the Caribbean, which is part of the new war against Spain that England had got sucked into. In both of these cases, Cromwell felt that God was nudging him and prompting him to try and encourage England to have a more godly focus, to bring in godly reforms. And so the major generals do 2 things. Firstly, they're there to impose law and order, and to do that they raise a militia using a 10% income tax on royalists, massively unpopular amongst royalists. But also they're there to try and impose this morality and force people, push people into behaving in a way that Cromwell and other Puritans saw as being as godly behaviour. So horse racing, bear baiting, less controversially perhaps, was outlawed. Sort of open drunkenness was clamped down upon. Swearing, some alehouses were shut. Gambling was prohibited. And now this was done there were 12 regions, 12 major generals across the country, and some were more proactive and successful than others. But this was the intention that Cromwell had. It was very unpopular, and when the second Protectorate Parliament met, they debated whether to legalise this the decimation tax, it was called the 10% tax, that funded the major generals, and it was voted down pretty comprehensively. And so the Major Generals end in 1657, and Cromwell has to go back to the more regular civilian way of running the country. In fairness to Cromwell, he doesn't resist this. He accepts that it's unpopular and kind of rolls with the punches and moves on. And that is to the Second Protectorate Parliament. In fact, the Second Protectorate Parliament had already been elected at the advice of the Major Generals, because there was a bubbling financial crisis in England due to this war against Spain that was declared in October 1655. France and Spain were vying for possession of the Low Countries and what we call Belgium and Holland. And England had, after some debate, sided with France against Spain. And so it's mostly a naval war, but they need cash for it. Now, when the Second Protectorate Parliament meets to try, with the hope Cromwell has of approving this cash, they do approve the vote for the war against Spain. But just like those parliaments of Charles I back in the 1620s, were not keen on raising further money, and they also vote down the Major General's taxation thing as well. And this was the Second Protectorate Parliament, which also oversaw the James Naylor case. Remember the famous James Naylor case? James Naylor had ridden into Bristol. He's a Quaker. He'd ridden into Bristol either pretending to be Jesus or perhaps claiming to be Jesus, and had been severely punished as a result because Parliament put him on trial. Now, even Cromwell felt that this was, Cromwell felt that this was going beyond their Parliament's limits. James Naylor, you might remember, was whipped and had his tongue bored, and he was branded B for blasphemer on his forehead, and then he was imprisoned for life after that too. So the Second Protectorate Parliament wasn't particularly helpful to Cromwell and didn't really reflect the sort of country that Cromwell was after either, although of course he wasn't really up for religious extremism either. And the final thing that the Second Protectorate Parliament does in the first half of its meeting is to offer the crown to Oliver Cromwell. Now, this is the start of the creation of the second constitution of our period, the humble petition and advice. And the idea of offering Cromwell the crown was to try and end military involvement because Cromwell obviously being coming out of the army, but also to say, look, the crown, we know what monarchs can do. We've got history of that, precedent of that, and it kind of limited Cromwell's abilities if he became king. But Cromwell, of course, after some debate amongst himself and with others, turned down the crown, and so the humble petition and advice, which is brought in 1657, actually just kind of reconfirms the sort of system that they have already. However, the big thing is that this is introduced by civilians, and it's made by the elected legitimate parliament that has been selected by the public-ish, as far as anything was democratic in those days. So Cromwell stayed Lord Protector. He could now nominate his successor, which was quite a big deal. And they were going to have two chambers in the Parliament, the elected House of Commons and an other house, which they didn't call the House of Lords, but a lot of people said, well, it's just the House of Lords. And that was very controversial. Members of the other house would be nominated by the Lord Protector, but approved by Parliament. And that was true of the Council of State, which was now just an advisory body for Cromwell. I won't worry too much about the ins and outs of that. I won't worry too much about the ins and outs of that. The second sort of phase of the Second Protectorate Parliament started in January 1658, where they're meeting now under the humble petition and advice. In fact, one of the things that happens here is that 93 MPs are admitted who Cromwell had kept out. Under the humble petition and advice, only Parliament could ban members from sitting in Parliament. And these 93 were people that Cromwell felt didn't reflect what the Protectorate was all about, and he felt under the instrument of government he had the right to keep them out. Now, unfortunately, these 93 arrived, about 30 members left to join the upper house, and that really led to endless debates about actually whether the other house was legal, and there were quite a lot of debates about whether even the Protectorate was legal, and Cromwell gets fed up with this pretty quickly and dissolves the Second Protectorate Parliament after 2 weeks. Cromwell then actually, so the next thing Oliver Cromwell does is nominate his son to be Lord Protector after him, and then in September 1658 he died, leaving Richard, his son, in charge. of England as Lord Protector. Unfortunately, he handed Richard what we might call a hospital pass in football, which is a pass which is, just not a very good one. Particularly the financial record of the Protectorate was poor. There was a national debt of £2.5 million when Richard became Lord Protector, an annual shortfall in income as against outgoings of £300,000, and significantly army pay arrears of £900,000. This meant that there was £900,000 owing to soldiers in the army. Now, of course, the army are not happy about being disbanded until they've been paid. Because of this, Richard calls the Third Protectorate Parliament in January 1659, and after quite a lot of debate about the Constitution, about whether it's all right and whether Richard's really legitimately the Lord Protector, it does seem by the start of April that Richard's position is pretty secure. However, Parliament then undermines really that position by calling on reforms for the army, and various kind of proposals are put forward which the army is extremely uncomfortable about. The army, Richard initially cited Parliament. The army then put massive pressure on Richard to dissolve the Third Protectorate Parliament as they continue to debate this and suggest things which the army finds outrageous. Richard reluctantly does dissolve Parliament on the 22nd of April 1659. And the next sort of manoeuvre is really the recalling of the Rump and Richard abdicating his position as Lord Protector, and then you're into the machinations for the Restoration, which really involve this debate about whether the army has a role or not, and who can stand above the army. And I think that the debate then focuses back on whether, if that's not a monarch, then who is it? So themes of this period, I would say, were very much military involvement. The military involved in the start of the Protectorate. John Lambert writes The Instrument of Government. Of course, the Major Generals are a big influence there. They are involved in the sense with the war against Spain, although that's kind of less of a part of running the country. And of course, they're involved there at the end, both with the debate about whether Richard should stay, and then also General Monk in the actual forming of the Restoration. The second big debate is about the legitimacy of the leader, who should lead the country, and whether a Lord Protector is just a king by any other name, or whether that's acceptable. There are a lot of so-called Republicans who don't want a king, but also don't want a Lord Protector. They want to go back to the Rump, particularly. And then the third area of theme that I would say that is worth debating here is to do with religion and reform. Now, some of that religion we'll see when we look more specifically at religion later on, and the toleration, but it shines through a little bit here in the story I've just given you with James Naylor, and also with the idea of the Major Generals, which was to institute these godly reforms. So themes, I would say, the involvement of the military, the power of the leader, and whether they're a monarch in disguise, and those religious reform type themes of Cromwell and of the Major Generals and of James Naylor. Why does it fall apart? Well, again, I would go back to those themes that we've talked about before of power, money, and religion. There's a debate about who has legitimate power and who can stand up to and reform the army, if not the Lord Protector. There are obviously massive money issues still. Taxation has been high and been unpopular, but now by 1659, the debt is high and unpopular and tricky to deal with, and so that continues to be something that, like a sore, that undermines the health of the Protectorate. And then, of course, the religious problems as well. There is a great fear through the whole Protectorate of religious extremism, and a worry that by allowing toleration, what you're actually allowing it for is the destabilization of society, and how you control that and to what extent you allow people freedom of expression is highly controversial. Thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time when we'll talk a bit about the Restoration and the basis on which that is sought. See you there.